yeah, we got to overturn.
You're listening to The E-Man, inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit. Last time you heard that specific theme, Anita Rosato and John Bushing were on the show, and that was back in, I want to say November, December, around there. That was the Transit Rescue Reunion show. And we're back for what is the 42nd Mariano Rivera, Jackie Robinson number, if you will, volume of this miniseries. It started a couple of years ago, 2021, with Sergeant John Lampkin. It's kind of taken on a life of its own and become a big project for this show, and has introduced me to a lot of really unique and cool people, one of which, of course, you're going to see tonight. If you haven't checked out the previous episode, and that one was a milestone one, that was the big one, 300, that was with the current New York City Fire Department Chief of Department, John Hodgins. And Chief Hodgins was great to talk to. Of course, his career began all the way back in March of 1986. He's still going strong with almost 38 years on the job. So it was a pleasure to talk to a guy like that and really pick his brain on what was going on then and what's going on now in the FDNY. And thank you to everybody that joined me for that milestone. Of course, a shout out to everybody tuning in thus far in the chat: John Costello, Jake Rixner, Christian Williams, Billy Ryan, of course, Joe Maliga, and anybody else that may be watching via YouTube. Not only YouTube, but also LinkedIn and Twitter tonight. Before we get to the guest, a couple of ads. And the first one is MC Media Editing Services. Need advice on how to start your podcast? Frustrated with the editing process? Can't find a voiceover guide? Hi, I'm Mike Colón, and I'm here to help. I'm the owner and founder of MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company for all things media, where I can offer you consulting advice on how to get started, and once you get started, editing, as well as voiceover work, all for a very reasonable price. If you want to reach me, you can contact me at 917-781-6189 or the email that you see listed here. I'm always available, and I'm always willing to help. Again, 917-781-6189. Why go to some giant consulting firm that's going to charge you an arm and a leg when you can just come to me? If you want to be stress-free, the way to go is to call MC. MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company. Johnny Latanzio, a veteran of 5 truck and 3 trucks in the chat. Hi, John. Always good to see you. And Dawn Marie's watching, too. Always good to see you as well. And, of course, the other advertisement tonight, if you ever need an Esquire, go to nobody else but Joe Murray. If you're ever caught on the wrong end of the law, call Joe Murray. Joe's a retired NYPD police officer turned criminal defense attorney. With 15 years of experience in the NYPD from 1987 until 2002, he parlayed a successful career in the NYPD into an equally successful career as a criminal defense attorney. His website is jmurray-law.com, where you can reach him at 646-838-1702, or just email him at joe@jmurray-law.com. Okay, thanks to Joe. My next guest knows both sides of the law. As both a New York City police officer and assistant district attorney. He joined the NYPD in 1985. And what's unique is across the variety of assignments he had from 85 until 1998, he spent pretty much all of his career on the street in Brooklyn. He started out in the 88 Precinct. Of course, there was NSU, but the 88 Precinct, Brooklyn North Task Force, Street Crime Unit, which is a citywide unit, and then finally the Emergency Service Unit in Truck 8. And in 1998, he went on loan to the district attorney's office after graduating law school, as we'll talk about. So he retired from the NYPD in 2005, but his police career transitioned long before that to something cool in its own right as a prosecutor, and he's still active in that field. And that, for this volume 42 of the E-Man inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit, is retired E-Man and current ADA, Tom Ridges. Tom, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing good, Mike. I'm doing good, and thank you for having me tonight.
Oh, thank you for being here. Long time coming to get you on. So as I was talking about, your police career was mostly in Brooklyn. Your roots as a person in general are in Brooklyn. You grew up in Bed-Stuy.
Exactly. But before we start, Mike, I'd like to just, this week we lost, I know I'm an NYPD guy, but we lost Bob Beckwith,
Yes.
who was FDNY guy. And we all have that image in our head of Bob Beckwith with President Bush at the time of 9/11, and Bush holding a bullhorn in one hand and his arm around him in the other. And we also recently lost Espo, Joe Esposito. Yeah. So I'd like to just, extend my thoughts and prayers to their families and their loved ones, and may they continue to rest in peace. What they meant to public service can't be described anywhere. Both of these men, one in the fire department, one in the police department. Next, I want to thank you for using this space the way that you do. When I tune in and I watch your shows, it's like a family reunion. I get to see the faces, I get to hear the names and the stories of people that I haven't seen in a long time, people that bring back memories, and it is like a actual family reunion, and you allow those stories to be shared with those that weren't a part of those experiences during the time. So we all understand the camaraderie and the brotherhood that we share in the name of public service, and you get that message out there. So thank you for what you do, and each and every week that you bring this show to us. And finally, I want to extend an apology because I know I'm going to mention some names tonight, and I'm sure I'm going to forget some names. And that's because, I'm old, and please attribute it to my head and not my heart. There are a lot of people that touched my life during my career that helped me to get to where I am at today. And I appreciate each and every one of them, even if I don't mention them by name. So I want to thank them for that.
Well said. Well said. And I'm glad you pointed that out, because sometimes, people message me after the show, and not in a bad way, but, oh, I was there on that job. That was me. He couldn't think of my name, but it was me who he was with. So I'm glad you mentioned that in the beginning, because that covers the bases early. See, that's why he's a prosecutor, ladies and gentlemen. So, tell me about your roots in Bed-Stuy.
Well, born and raised in Bed-Stuy, I grew up in the Sumner Housing Projects, one of the toughest housing projects in the city at the time. In the confines of the 79th precinct. I always tell people I never thought I'd be a police officer, never wanted to be a police officer. I had actually wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to do what you do, Mike. I went to, I took the police test as a teenager as a fluke. Like I said, I had no intention of becoming a police officer, but I did take the test. I graduated from John Jay High School in Park Slope. I got accepted to Penn State. I went to Penn State University, but being a poor kid from Brooklyn and an out-of-state resident, I couldn't afford to stay there. So I came back to New York City and went to St. John's undergrad, and I was there for a year and a half. And again, still being poor because I never hit the lottery. Tuition was expensive, couldn't afford to stay there. And the police department called me as a result of that test. And they said, hey, you've deferred us twice already for educational purposes. This is the third time. If you defer again, then you'll have to take the test all over and start the process all over. I spoke to some people I respected at the time, and they said, listen, you can always go back to school. Police department is a career. It's an opportunity to do things to help others. So do it. So I went into the police academy in July of 1985, July 8th of 1985, company 85-68. And the rest is, as they say, history. It wasn't my first decision, but it turned out to be the best decision I ever made.
Oh, and I like how you put that, because and you're not the only one that's told a story like that, where someone said, hey, listen, take the test, even if you don't want the job. And it's not just a police department, fire department too. Even if you don't want the job, you can say no, but just take it, because you never know what's going to happen. And they always say, even though I originally had no aspirations of being a fireman or being a police officer, as you just finished saying, it turned out to be the best decision I ever made, because look at the doors that it opens, And that's definitely the case with the previous guests we've had. That's definitely.
Absolutely. I tell people being in the police department was the best decision I made, because it taught me a lot of lessons. I learned life lessons that I've been able to use throughout my personal life and throughout my career as a prosecutor, throughout my interactions with people on an everyday basis or on a professional basis. I always say, if you are NYPD trained, you can handle any situation. I've seen prosecutors sweating and stressing, and they're like, you never get stressed out. I said, I was a police officer. I didn't know if I was going home at the end of the night. This isn't stress. I mean, the biggest stress you have as a prosecutor is worried about getting a paper cut.
Yeah, and you were an E-man on top of that. So
exactly.
talk about pressure. Listen, I've been on the George Washington Bridge talking down suicidal jumpers. I'm not worried about this.
Well, in my case, it was the Manhattan Bridge, but
yeah, and that's not easy in its own right. So the thing is, after getting out of the academy, going into NSU, we all, in any new job that we're starting, we all suffer from what I call NGS, which is new guy syndrome, and that you're petrified of doing the wrong thing. You want to make sure you do the right thing. You want to make sure you start your new career on the right foot. So this NSU you were assigned to, tell me about trying to find your footing as an officer early on, and who were the senior figures in your command that helped you find that footing and, allow you to mold yourself into an ideal police officer.
Mike, it's funny you bring that up. You talk about new guy syndrome, but new guy syndrome is not as bad as if you have great guys around you. And I was assigned to NSU 14, which covered the 7-7, the 7-9, the 8-8, and the 8-4. And when I got to NSU, you still had the field training officers back then who would take you out, and they taught you how to be a cop, how to handle situations, how to deal with people, how if you were going to give someone a summons, it wasn't a good thing, but it was a situation where you didn't have to berate the person, talk down to them. You never wanted to make that situation worse for the next cop that had to deal with that person. So when I got to NSU 14, I had field training officers like Whitey Gilbert, we called him Bo, Larry Washington, Jerry Joyer. Then there were the guys in the class that had gotten out before me, guys like Mike Prate. Oh my God, he had only gotten out from the class before me, but I got to tell you, Mike and I were joined at the hip throughout my career. Even when I became a prosecutor, I would handle homicide cases that Mike were involved in. So I remember those first lessons as the new kid on the block, the new guy syndrome, and having a guy like Mike Prate, who wasn't a training officer. The training officers were, like I said, Whitey Gilbert, Larry Washington, Jerry Joyer. But having a guy who had just gotten out the academy like a Mike Prate who could pull you off to the side and say, hey, this is how we do this. This is how the command is. These are the hot spots. These are the good spots. These are the guys you want to watch out for. Again, you can't quantify that. You can't talk about how valuable those lessons were.
No, not and I'm glad you mentioned a guy like Mike Prick because he's been on the show previously for my hostage negotiation miniseries. And you're right. What a mind. Very, very knowledgeable guy. Again, somebody that you would call the real police. And he was excited when I put out the promo that you were coming on, and he reposted, as he always says. He's a big supporter of this show. So thank you for mentioning him. And he was involved. And it was crazy. He got the medal for it a couple of years after the fact. I think in '93, he was involved in a crazy shootout. I think it was a car chase. That was also a running gun battle. So that guy's seen some stuff and done some stuff.
Mike Prate has worked on some of the more serious cases in this city. If someone in my family were the victim of a crime and I wanted someone to investigate that incident, Mike Prate's the guy that I'd have full confidence and faith in. Mm-hmm. He is someone that should be teaching an investigator's course somewhere.
I echo those sentiments 110%. Again, thank you for mentioning him. Now, the city, and then again, and I preface this by saying not every part of the city was consumed by this, but certain portions of the city certainly were, which is that kind of that war zone era of New York, and Brooklyn certainly had its points. And where you were working, I think, listen, it was probably pretty busy. I think it's safe to assume you're not too far away from the confines of the 7-5, which the old motto there was, you give us 22 minutes, we'll give you a homicide. So working in an environment like that, listen, as a police officer in a city like New York, you're always on alert. You have to be, especially nowadays, and it certainly was true back then. But working in confines like that, even though guys are helping you break in and they're helping you find your footing, what was it like to police in an area where there was just so much violence?
Well, again, you always had to be on your toes. You always had to be on guard. But you also realized that, especially me as someone who had grown up in that area, you realize that as bad as things are, there were good people in that area. There were people that, you know what, they didn't want the shootings and the homicides and the robberies and everything else. They just wanted to be able to go from their house to the subway, to work, to the supermarket, etc. You're growing up in that area and you're seeing the worst of the worst. I always tell people, and by that, I'm not talking to people, I'm talking incidents. You're seeing the worst of the worst incidents. I always say people don't pick up the phone and dial 911 because something good is happening to them. Right. People pick up the phone and dial 911 because something bad's happened to them, whether it's a burglary, a robbery, an assault, someone's not feeling well, it's a It could be a car accident. People are calling you because they want your assistance. And if you come there with a chip on your shoulder, you come there with an attitude, then you're victimizing them a second time, the phenomenon called secondary victimization. You have to understand that people may not want to initially talk to you because they're upset. They're courting their feelings at the moment. They're angry. They're upset. You have to not take it personal and be able to relate to them. And those are the lessons I'm talking about that you learn from a Mike Prate or a Larry Washington that tell you, listen, people may be angry. They're not angry at you. They're angry that someone just took their wallet or someone just pointed a gun at them or someone just fired a shot at them. And you have to learn people skills. You have to learn how to talk. And that's where having those senior guys around assists you in using common sense to communicate. Again, if you start off from a bad position, that's not good. You have to start off and work, get that trust, earn that trust, and go from there.
So let's stay on that for a second, because you bring up an interesting point, which is, are there rough encounters as a police officer? Yeah, because you're marching into a lot of really, really rough situations, but there's also plenty of rewarding ones, and you had your share across your 13 years in the field. So what were the encounters you can recall from those early days on patrol that made you say afterwards, man, I am so glad I took this job?
Delivering a baby. I've delivered 3. When you're in that situation, you're bringing life into this world. You see so much negativity. Delivering a baby, that's bringing joy. That's, you're bringing happiness to the parents. You're bringing life into this world, etc. Also, you know what? Finding a lost child. Parents are freaking out. They're stressed out, and you're able to find that child. Or just being there at an 8 case, holding someone's hand until EMS arrives. The fact that someone who didn't know you 30 seconds ago is now counting on you to be their savior, counting on you to make a wrong situation right. Those are the things that bring, joy to you and make you say, you know what, this was a good decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm laughing because besides the fact it's a hat trick of bringing 3 babies into the world, you watch the social.
I got 3, Mike.
You got 3. You watch it, so Joe Maliga always has that question in the chat for PD and FD guys, which is, did you ever deliver a baby? It's him and I's running joke. He put in the chat, my question shot to crap early on. Very good. So you're welcome, Joe, because he always asks that. And sometimes I miss it, which I feel bad for. But tonight you answered it without me even having to ask it. So thanks for mentioning that. Now, after patrol, I believe you went to the Brooklyn North Borough-wide Task Force. This is a pretty big step up because it's borough-wide. It's not the same as street crime. It's a little bit different. That's citywide. But nevertheless, listen, if they're looking at you for a task force like that, that means they think highly of you. That means you're out on the street making good collars. So how did that opportunity open up?
Well, again, at that time, you would put in an application to go to Brooklyn North Task Force. And again, it was every precinct in the borough. I had spent my time in the 8-8. I felt that, with the 8-8, which was 1 square mile, I was like, okay, it's time to see other precincts. So I applied. I interviewed with Lieutenant Fisher at the time, and I was accepted into the unit. And Brooklyn North Task Force at the time was a rapid mobilization unit. You were supposed to be there. And again, it's what now they refer to as SRG, I believe. So
yep.
Back then it was Brooklyn North Task Force, and you would cover all of the 10 precincts in Brooklyn North. And depending on where you were assigned, so one night you might have the 7788. One night you might have the 79. One night you might be in the 7375. So you got a chance to see a variety of neighborhoods, different demographics. You had a chance to see different cops. You had a chance to see cops. You had a chance to work in a precinct that was busy, like the 7375, 79, 77. Then you had a chance to work in precincts like the 94, maybe not as busy. Or you also got to see different types of crime. You're dealing with some of the violent crimes in the 73, 75, 79, and you're dealing with some lesser crimes, although equally important crimes, in other precincts like the 8-8, the 9-4, 9-0, those types of situations. So it was interesting. I mean, There were great people that I met. My ex-partner in Brooklyn North Task Force, Joe Meyer, retired now. He's down in Florida. We talk a lot. And, Joe had been a state correction officer, so he had already had experience in dealing with, law enforcement in that sense. And I learned a lot from him, and, Joe Holmes, who did DWE, who was a DWE supervisor at the time, one of the mildest mannered guy. You talk about a guy, I don't think I've ever seen Joe upset, scream, or whatever. And he had a Southern accent, and he would always say, Regis, just relax, just relax. Everything's going to be okay. And, Joe was an older man. And again, he taught you life lessons about the police department. And, he had been on the police force during the TPF days, the Tactical Patrol Force.
Oh,
days.
yeah.
So he was able to talk about, if you think things are bad now, you should have been around with TPF and, what we had to do. So, those were some of the important life lessons that you learned. And it was an experience in Brooklyn North Task Force. Like I said, it allowed me to broaden my horizons. I had been, like I said, the 8-8 precinct and that community. But in task force, you got to see, like I said, a lot of different neighborhoods, a lot of different types of crimes, a lot of different demographics, and you got to learn the borough.
Yeah, and that's good because let's say you're ever, and they always tell cops this when they're starting out their career. It didn't matter back then if you were housing, transit, or city, know where you are. So if you're working in different parts of the borough, and God forbid you got to put a 1013 over the air, or you hear another cop give a 1013, you know where they are. Oh, absolutely. I've been there. I worked there. I was just there the other day. I was just there last week. Okay, I'm here. And in that moment, knowing where you are, knowing where they are makes a big difference. So that's an underrated benefit of these task forces, because not only does it build camaraderie, not only does it build careers, it also can really help you out if you're ever in a bad situation or another officer.
Absolutely. I tell people all the time, I got a lot of degrees now, but the best degree I got was from the School of Brooklyn North.
I like that.
That was the best degree I got.
Mm-hmm. It's one of the best educations you can get. So now to a citywide unit in street crime, where street crime was part of SOD back then. And here's a unit where, as I've covered many times previously with guys who are alumni of it, is that you're not chasing the radio. Unless it's a major job, like I said, a 1013, everybody's going. That's different. Otherwise, if it's the conventional calls that a sector car can handle, you're not dealing with that. You're waiting for someone to do something. And you talk about an education, there's an education in patience, because sometimes you could be there in the same spot 4 or 5 hours, nobody does anything. That's good. No crimes are being committed. But other nights, it's rocking, it's rolling, and you're trying to blend in. Because these criminals, listen, as I've covered before, they're making dumb choices. Yes. But they're not necessarily dumb people all the time. They're wise to the streets. They know who's a cop. Sometimes they could pick them out a mile away. So getting into SCU and then, of course, putting those practices to the streets and making good collars, what was that like? And do you feel having grown up in Brooklyn allowed you to, have a better understanding than most street crime cops of where you were working, how to blend in?
Absolutely. I always say, before I became a cop, my education came from the street. There's street sense, there's common sense, there's book sense. Right. Growing up in Brooklyn, as a young kid, you learn street sense. You learn to know your surroundings. You know who is a player, who the bad guys are, just because you grew up around them. You know when someone's up to no good. Continuing on the theme of expansion, so now I went from the 8-8 precinct to Brooklyn North Task Force, because I wanted to expand. Now you're expanded from a borough-wide unit to a city-wide unit. And street crime back then, during those high crime days when you're talking about all the murders in the city and everything else, every precinct commander wanted street crime deployed to their precinct. They wanted street crime to make the gun collars. Our motto back then was, we own the night. And you go out into the precincts. Again, you didn't know the precinct. For example, one night you're working in the 7-5, the next night you are up in the 4-6 or the 4-3, or you're in the 103 or the 113, and you're learning it on the fly. And, I hate to date myself, but there was no GPS back then. You're learning these streets based on, pin maps and Hagstrom's and trying to get a flavor for where the crime patterns are. And again, you're going into these precincts and you don't know the officers, and the color of the day was very important then, because they're seeing you, but they don't know who you are. You're jumping out of a car, So again, it was important to learn geography, important to learn the dynamics of what's going on, and it helped you hone your skills as an investigator, trying to anticipate where they're going to strike next. There's this robbery pattern in the 4-6. They've hit here, here, and here. Where are they going next? What's the common thread here for what they're doing? Why are they doing this? And again, it makes you think. The one thing that the NYPD makes you do as an officer, whether it's on patrol, whether it's in the street crime, whether it's in the task force, whether it's at ESU, it makes you think, and it makes you, stay alert, stay on your toes. You're always aware. You're always aware. You're always thinking that next step. You're always aware of your surroundings. It's the reason that as officers, we go into restaurants, we don't sit with our back to the door. There's reasons that we can, as we're driving along, I guarantee you, everybody that's watching this podcast now, when they're driving, they're always conscious of their surroundings. That's just something that is ingrained in you forever. You're always looking around. You can be having a conversation face to face with someone, but you're looking off to your left. You're looking off to your right. You're thinking about who's that walking down the hall. I'm listening to you, but I'm also looking to see what's going on, who's coming around. So right. Again, these are skills, like I said, that's why I said, if you're NYPD trained, you can handle anything.
Yeah. No, you know what? I'm glad we could talk about street crime, because it wasn't, and you see the reverence guys that were in it still have for it, because here's a unit that, compared to other units in the NYPD's history, that was not around that long. Started up in 1971, was disbanded by then Commissioner Kelly in 2002. But even though it was only around 31 years, not long compared to other ones, look at the impact it had. And when you look at that turnaround, especially in the 90s, from 94 all the way through its disbandment, look at the decline. A big part of that, I mean, it took a team effort. It was everyone. A huge part of that was SCU. Huge part of that.
Well, again, that's where, like I said, the phrase "we own the night" came from. We had a wall where we would go into precincts and, we would make these gun collars, and, you'd see the gun collars from every precinct that we had. You also had, people at the upper level, like Chief Anamone, people that, they were about policing, strategic policing. They allowed you to be police officers. They allowed you to be cops, and they allowed you to do your job. And I always say, when we look at the numbers of where we're at now compared to where we were then, we should pat ourselves on the back for the work that we did. Anybody that, that's on this podcast or that was around then, there's a reason that this became one of the safest cities in a long time, in almost 50 years, the crime numbers a few years ago.
Mm-hmm. And think about the guys from street crime that gave their lives in the process. Think about Bobby Bilodeau in 1980, and these are just some of the guys. Abe Walton. Think about Kevin Gillespie. It took guys like that giving their literal blood, sweat, and tears for that turnaround to happen. So
I mean, there were sometimes operations where we played as a decoy. Think about you're asking people to act as a decoy, to put their lives on the line, to be a decoy, to try to become a victim. You're asking the cop to be a decoy and become a victim so we can apprehend the perpetrator, and no one else has to be that victim. Yeah. That's a dangerous situation to lay in a doorway waiting for someone to try to rip you off.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And cops were doing it back then, night and day. And again, they were doing it in transit. Jack Maple, when he was in transit, had some of the best decoys around for that very reason. They would put themselves in harm's way willingly, waiting for a subway robber. And 9 times out of 10, it would work out in their favor. Pete Pranzo, who you see in the chat often on this show, he's about to go on vacation, by the way. So shout out to you, Pete. I hope you enjoy it. He says, yo, SCU, and we did own the night, Tommy. So thank you very much, Peter, for contributing that. And just to go back earlier.
Just like you mentioned, when you just mentioned Jack Maple, but I mentioned Louis Anamone. When you talk about the creators of CompStat and the ones that said, hey, you know what? We're going to look at these numbers. We're going to figure out where the hot pockets are, and we're going to let our cops go in there and be cops. And you know what? Not enough is said about Chief Louis Anamone or Jack Maple, God rest his soul, and what they did during those times when, like I said, you're talking over 2,000 murders a year.
Yeah. No, Anamone he's a good friend of mine, and he's been on this show multiple times. The man. Yes. The man. There was a guy that, even though he was chief of department, even though he was chief of patrol, he never lost who he was. He was always a street cop at heart. And that's why people to this day, Anamone's been retired since 1999. You ask anybody that was working for him during any point in his career to this day, they would still run through a brick wall for the guy.
Mike, it's funny you say that because you're absolutely right. There's a guy who was chief of department, but never forgot who he was. He was what you would call a cop's cop. He never forgot who he was. And you know what? I am one of those guys that you could say, I'd run through a brick wall for him today as well.
Yep. Yeah. I never even worked for the man, but I wish I did because I would have run through a brick wall for him too. And we're talking with Tommy Richards. This is volume 42 of the EMED inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit. John Costello's in the chat as well, and I appreciate you watching, John, tonight. And to your point about cop mode, Tommy, he's like, yep, because he was a sergeant in Pennsylvania. He was on the job 45 years. He says, drove my wife nuts, called it my cop mode. So it's everybody. It's not just New York City cops. And for those of you...
There's no way to turn off cop mode. That's the point. Once you're in cop, you're always in cop mode.
Yeah, even it never leaves you.
We drive certain ways based on cop mode.
Defensive driving. You know, that's for life. That's for life. That oath does not expire when you retire, as they say. And for those of you watching tonight on YouTube, if you want to have a question answered, feel free to throw it in the super chat if you would be so kind, and I'll make sure I get to it at the appropriate time. That option is always available. So, you know, street crime, it's interesting because I didn't know you could do this until Steve Stefanakis explained it to me a while ago. And a couple guys did do it. Danny Cohen went from street crime to ESU. The late Stephen Driscoll, who unfortunately lost his life on 9/11, he went from street crime to ESU. Since it's in SOD, so you can do that. You go from street crime to emergency service. Now, this is something dramatically different than street crime, plainclothes policing, emergency service. You're essentially on the front line in a much different way. Any job that patrol feels they can't handle, who do they call? The police, or excuse me, the emergency service unit, because what's the old adage? When a civilian needs help, they call the police. When the police need help, they call the emergency service unit. What was it? I mean, listen, you're pretty within the police department. You have to have a type A personality, so I know where that aspect of it came from. But what was it in particular besides that attracted you to emergency service?
Well, first of all, you had always heard about emergency service. They were the guys that, you know what, when you were backed up or when you needed something, you called these guys and they were there. You were there to help the public. They were there to help you. And, you know, again, to me, that was kind of like a dream that I never thought would be attainable. ESU, I mean, I didn't have a specialized skill. I did become an EMT prior to going into ESU because I figured by becoming an EMT, that would help my chances of getting into ESU. But what the one break I got, and I forgot what the incident was, Mike, so I apologize, but Chief Selvaggi at the time had said, you couldn't stay in a plainclothes unit more than 3 years without being transferred out. So my time in street crime was running out. And I said, well, you know what? I can't think of any place else I'd want to go. I always wanted ESU. Let me put in the application. The worst they could do is say no. And like I said, knowing that, I became an EMT to help bolster that. I think what made it easier for me was, like you said, I was already in SOD, so it was considered a lateral transfer. They weren't plucking a body out of somebody's patrol burrow, and that person would have to be replaced. I was already in that portfolio, so to say, of SOD. So I went through the interview, went through the testing and everything, and knock on wood, I got it. So that was, and again, it was a great decision as well. I met some wonderful people. I learned a lot. I only had the EMT skill going in, but I learned so much from so many during that time. And I got to work in one of the best trucks. I know the guys are going to kill me, but I got to work at the flagship, Truck 8.
It's funny. No matter where you work, I mean, there's loyalty to the unit, but there's also loyalty to the truck. Every guy, no matter which truck they worked in, 6 trucks the best, no, 10 trucks the best, 1 truck's where, you know. And so I don't get involved. I love them all equally, but I totally get the loyalty to each truck.
I love all my brothers and sisters in ESU as well, but They'll tell you if they were being honest, Truck 8 was the flagship.
And you guys were racing in one truck to some of these jobs on the Brooklyn Bridge, depending on where you guys were coming from, too. I remember Kevin Coots were telling me that.
Everybody would be racing to the bridge.
on good jumper jobs. And you know, I'm a little biased, but I think a lot of people would agree from even outside the ESU realm, which is that unit. I don't care what police department you're talking about, not just anywhere in the country, but anywhere in the world, is perhaps the most well trained special operations unit in existence because it's not just the tactical aspect. People think of ESU, and if you're not familiar with the NYPD, you think, oh, SWAT. That's part of it. Yeah, that's part of it. You're doing tactical entries, you're doing tactical work. There's so much more. 1 second, you're a medic, you're going to a car accident and you're rendering aid. Next second, you're an emergency psychological technician. We've heard of EMT. There's EPT too, where again, those jumper jobs, or somebody's behind the door with a gun to their head, they're thinking about ending it all. You got to talk that person down. No other unit that I can think of in the country or in the world does that. And no other unit, if they do indeed do those type of things, are as skilled at it as ESU, to the point where ESU is going around the country, going around the world, training other units on how to do these things.
I mean, think about what you just said, Mike. It's 100% true. 1 minute, you could be standing on the other side of a door for a barricaded perpetrator. You could be standing on the other side of a door of someone who is threatening to hurt someone inside. You could be standing on the other side of a door of someone who's threatening to hurt themselves. You could be underneath a subway train trying to, help someone who, help people involved in a derailment. You could be hanging out of a window. You could be hanging off of, climbing the Brooklyn Bridge or the Manhattan Bridge, as I mentioned earlier. You could be doing a water rescue. You could be doing an elevator job. You could be performing EMT functions. So in any given day, there's a number of different emergencies, a number of different situations that you're being called to, and you have to be able to go from one situation to the next and handle each of those situations. In emergency service, we had a model. You never tell a cop no. You never leave a cop stranded. No matter what happens, you do whatever you need to do to assist that officer. And there's that motto in ESU that whatever the situation that you're dealt with, you improvise, you adapt, and most importantly, you overcome. You improvise, adapt, and overcome, and that's built into your mantra. That when the bell rings, you answer. There is no, well, we can't do anything. No ESU man has ever been called to a job and tells the officer, well, there's nothing we can do. No, you figure something out and you do something. And again, that's why when they say when a cop needs help, he calls ESU. It's 100% correct.
Yeah, of course. And Latanzio's in the chat. He calls it the Swiss Army knife for the NYPD, and he's absolutely right. And I forgot to mention to you earlier, Tony Johnson's in the chat. My bad, Tony. He's watched tonight, and he sends his regards. Another
Hey, Tony, how are you?
He'll be on the show soon. He's a big supporter of this show. It doesn't matter what it is, because here's the thing: after emergency service, who else are you calling?
Yeah,
you guys are you guys are it. So if ESU can't do anything, then we're cooked. So that's a situation where you're right. Even then if you may not know,
the dignitary protection aspect of it. I mean, when the president comes into town, I've spent 14 hours standing in a stairwell, at the Waldorf because you're part of the security detail for the president. I mean, think about it. So you're in a stairwell 14 hours by yourself. I mean, again, it's you do what's required of you to do it. And people talk back then about the battle of the badges and everything else. I always tell people, why you had those fights or whatever, it's because we were both trained in the fire department. I'm sure trained the same way to do what is needed. And it wasn't a fight out of hatred. It was a fight out of wanting to get the job done and to help people. So you know what? The battle of the badges, it was all about love and trying to assist the public, trying to help people that may never know your name. I mean, you think about it. When you go to these jobs, you don't do it for gratitude. You don't do it for thank yous. You don't do it for a pat on the back. You do it because that's in your DNA, whether it's the fire department or ESU or whatever else. You're there to help someone in need. It's about you doing public service, serving the public. It's in your DNA. That's why you raised your right hand. That's why you took the oath. And that's why you applied to be in, whether it's rescue or ESU. they're voluntary units. No one gets drafted to go to rescue. No one gets drafted to go to ESU. You put in for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's the highlight of the show. I already know what highlight I'm using tomorrow morning when I put the clip out. It's going to be that, right? Because it's true. Listen, again, we talked about it earlier, type A personalities. And here's another layer to it. Like, as you said, not only is it not voluntary, when you go in there, learn every tool. Because as Jack Cambria once pointed out on this show, when he was a young ESU officer, one of the senior guys in the truck told him when he showed him the truck, this side of the truck is for saving lives. The other side of the truck is for taking them.
There you go.
Learn each one.
Learn each
Because you
side.
may, yep, you may
And
have
know
to use
and know when you have to go to which side of the truck.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you mentioned Jack Cambria, and I got to tell you, there is a man that, again, as we call him, Gentleman Jack.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know anyone that has a bad word to say about Gentleman Jack, and he was just. I learned a lot from him. He was a supervisor at Truck 6 when I was in emergency service, and in emergency service you fly from truck to truck, so you may be assigned to Truck 8, but tomorrow night you might have to fly to Truck 4, or you may have to fly to Truck 6 or Truck 1, and that's the other part of it too. We all have our home trucks that we're assigned to. But we were flying around from one truck to the next on any given day, on any given night, helping each other. And that's why I said the camaraderie there is unbelievable. You know what? You brag about your truck, but you know what? If you had to fly the 4 truck, you were working a 4 truck that day. And you were there to do the same job that you would do in 8 truck in 4 truck. And again, it's a brotherhood like none other. And I say that about not just ESU, but the police department. The police, I tell people when they go, oh, you're not a former cop, you're always a cop. You're not a retired cop, you're always a cop. You can stick the word retired in front of my name, but like the gentleman said in the chat, you're always in cop mode. There's no such thing as former. There's no such thing as a former Marine. You're always a Marine. It's the same thing. I feel like with the police, you're always a police officer.
Yeah. No, and here's another aspect of ESU I forgot to mention earlier. Sometimes you guys aren't defusing the bombs, but you're at bomb scenes where all of a sudden you just went from helping a lady get her purse out of a storm drain, and all of a sudden, hey, there's a suspicious package. Go help the bomb technician get dressed up.
Absolutely. I've been at some of those jobs where you're helping the bomb tech get dressed. I was at the scene of a subway bombing, Broadway in Nassau, and again, you're at the scene and most people are running away from that scene. Most people are trying to get away from that scene. You're running towards the scene. And I was on the job during a time in ESU where when you showed up, you might have been a cop, but the inspectors, the chief, they were all like, hey, ESU, what do you need? What do you want? This is an inspector, a captain, deputy inspector. They're looking to you for guidance as to what to do. Do you need us to block off the street? The street? Do you need us to set up a perimeter? ESU, what do you need? So they knew right there. All right, the specialists are coming in. What do they need in this area?
So you're getting to emergency service in 1993, and I think that bombing you're talking about, I covered it for my Bomb Squad miniseries. It was when Eddie Leary set off the firebomb on the 4 train, I think, December of 94. But you're getting into ESU during a big year for them because 1993 is the World Trade Center bombing, which to that point in the unit's history was the biggest job they'd ever had. And a lot changed for them in terms of how they operated after that because nobody to that point had seen anything of that magnitude. An 8 truck, as you said, interesting place to work. In a borough like Brooklyn, a lot's changing on the job as it is around that time. So from that first year alone in emergency as a rookie E-man, tell me about some of the jobs that stand out and some of the people who really helped you, again, hone your skills this time as an emergency service officer.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because that bombing job, I was in STS at the time, Specialized Training School. That was the first bombing. That was when my best friend, Rodney Gillis, responded to the World Trade Center for the first time. He was already in ESU at that time. And he, again, and we'll talk more about him, hopefully, if we have time later.
Oh, we will.
Because again, that was his first dealing with the World Trade Center. But when I got to ESU, again, you're the new kid on the block. You can't sit on the Norga High. You can't touch the remote. There are certain things you can't do. You're not truck qualified yet, so you can't drive the truck. You're not a chauffeur yet. but I had great guys around me in Truckgate that were very supportive. No one ever criticized me or knocked me for my lack of a lot of skill set. Like I said, the only thing I had to waive was a EMT card, but there were guys like Dave Kane, the late Joe Laporte, God rest his soul. Johnny Bose, whose brother's tragic death we just commemorated a few weeks ago. Tony Sampietro, everybody knows Tony Sampietro. Billy Pizak, who I've been looking for years. He was
you and I both.
Exactly. Billy Pizak was actually taught me how to drive the bomb tractor trailer, the bomb disposal truck. Dave Can, who qualified me to be truck qualified and taught me how to drive the big truck, we call it. And then I was there for the merger when Transit ESU, Housing ESU all became one. And we got guys like Daryl Summers and Craig Hunter to come to the truck, and it was just a wonderful experience. Ronnie Griffith, who I just saw recently at a police officer funeral for Darrell Patterson. Then you had, some of the older school guys when I went to the late tour, like Billy Otting, Nick Colangelo, Mario Zorvik, John Reardon. These are guys that, like I said, they never knocked you for not being as adept in different skill areas as they were. Then there was the truck lieutenant, Richie Green. God, no, he had a way about you. Richie Green he didn't suffer fools easily. Let me say that. He was someone that would tell you, you know what, if you messed up, he had no problem letting you know you messed up and it wasn't going to happen again. He would always threaten to bounce you from the truck and you didn't want to leave a truck. And then there's the guys from other trucks, Brian Waterbury, Tony Cuccia, who oversees REMA now, the Retired Emergency Men Association, Cliff Massab, Tony Favera. I mean, these are guys that, no matter what truck you went to, Tony Johnson, who you mentioned earlier, these are guys, whether you went to Manhattan North, Brooklyn South, wherever you had to go, Queens, these are guys that, welcomed you into the fold. And these were some experienced senior emergency men, the late Mike Hansen. These were guys that, they didn't mind taking the time to talk to you. Dave Kane, like I said, I mentioned him 3 times already because Dave is the type of guy that if you wanted to learn how to work a particular tool, he'd go down into the garage with you and he'd explain it to you from A to Z. He'd say, this is the fuel intake that it takes. This is how you start it. This is when you would use it. Tying knots, knots are very important in emergency service. These are guys that would take the time to explain to you why you tie a knot a certain way, what you tie off on, all of that. I mean, you can't put a value, you can't qualify how important that was to be the new kid on the block with all these experts and not feel like a moron, not feel like, well, you know what, I'm here, but do I belong here? What am I doing here? And again, I became a better E-man because of each one of these guys that I mentioned and a lot of other people who, like I said, I haven't mentioned or neglected to mention,
Yeah. So many great people that played a central role. And, I'm glad you mentioned the merger because that was not easy. But God, as I've covered before, did it work out so well? And that here comes housing, and they weren't around too long. Housing Rescue had only been around as its own independent unit for 8 months, and then they were on loan to ESU. So these guys were pretty much already in the unit anyway. From a working standpoint, the merger just made it official. Transit had it harder because Transit had a little bit of a history to them. They started up at the fall of 77. They had been around a while. They had some big jobs, and they hadn't had any prior working experience specifically in ESU training. Yeah, but that's where it started and stopped. For them to come over and like I mentioned, John Bushing and Anita Rosato earlier, Franco Baraducci, Kenny Schnetzler, many others, assimilate as well as they did is a credit to both ESU and a credit to them as well. And you saw the benefit of that. So, and that made ESU stronger. ESU was
absolutely
250 at the time, 400 cops beefed up to in 95.
Absolutely. And it also brought in guys that had a particular skill set that, listen, if you were an ESU guy and you got called to a subway thing, yes, you would figure it out. You'd make it work. But to have guys that had done it and could train you on it, like when I remember when Daryl Summers was training us about slipping the shoe, the term that he talked about to prevent yourself from getting electrocuted and things like that. This was great. Again, it couldn't have been easy for them. So I empathize with them because I can't imagine being in your own unit, your own department. Now you're being told about the merger and you're being told you have to integrate with this other department and this other unit. But it made ESU, it made the unit much better having that merger. And it makes you wonder why no one had thought about it sooner.
No, they had, but and what's a long story, the unions for both departments fought it religiously until the bitter end, and it was bitter. But ultimately, even if many didn't want it or some didn't want it, I think even they would tell you it worked out for the best at the end of the day. Now,
the other part that makes ESU great, though, Mike, and I'm sure, again, I keep referring to the fire department awards, but I'm sure the rescue guys, what makes them as great as well is the fact that the training, you're continuously training. You're humble. You don't think that, oh, okay, I'm ESU, so I know all and I don't need to learn anymore. You're always training. That's number one. And then you learn from your mistakes, because that's not to say that mistakes aren't made. But after every job, you do your after action analysis to say, hey, what did we do right? What did we do wrong? What could we do better? So that the next time we have this type of a job, guess what? We'll be that much more better than we were this time. And you know what? It may have taken us 30 minutes to accomplish the task this time, but maybe next time it'll take us 20 minutes. Maybe the time after that, 15 minutes.
Yeah. Repetition, allows for eventual perfection. You keep practicing, and practicing, because the more you do it, the more you understand. And there's things you're able to identify. Oh, I didn't know I could do this. Absolutely. Yeah, let's try. Oh, it works. You know what? Hey. And then all of a sudden now the next time after that, it's 10 minutes. So you keep doing it and doing it and doing it. And you're right. That's the beauty of ESU, to where look at a guy. I take a guy like Steve Stefanakis, right? And I talk to him pretty often on LinkedIn. There's a guy that's been in emergency service since, if you count his time in housing rescue, 1994. 1994. It'll be 30 years for him in emergency service this year. Wow. Congratulations in advance, Steve, on that.
Congratulations, Steve.
And yet the guy still trains as if he just got there. That tells you all you need to know.
That's what I was just talking about. You never think that there's nothing you can learn as an E-man. As an E-man, you're always learning, and more importantly, you're always teaching too. I'm sure Steve in his 30 years has taught, has touched, has impacted, and has produced good E-men as well. That there are a lot of E-men that will say, hey, I learned this because of Steve. I'm grateful for Steve for this reason. Because again, it means nothing if you know how to do something or can do a skill but won't share it. What's the point of having it? You sharing that skill with someone might allow them to help someone if you're not around.
Right.
It also might help them to keep from getting injured themselves if you show them a proper way or a better way to do something. So again, that's the reason that ESU has such a storied history, is because of guys like Steve, Stefanakis and others in emergency service that they know it, they do it, they teach it.
Yeah. And they love to teach. That's the other thing too. It's not, okay, here's how we operate. They're into it. They love it. They live it. And that's a great thing too, because if they're joyful about it and they're enthusiastic about it, that's contagious.
Well, as I said, Mike, it's in your DNA. It's in your DNA.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one thing I wanted to ask you about is that Atom car. You're riding around in it, and sometimes it's not the jobs you catch when you're in quarters and you're going over the equipment and you hear the job come over the air. Sometimes you're out on patrol and they're coming in, and you don't know, as we talked about earlier, what type of job it's going to be. We talked about both sides of the truck earlier. Could be you're using some tools on the Atom car for a situation where you may have to take somebody's life, or in other instances to save somebody's life. But the call comes in and it's exciting. Sometimes you hear it on the SOD scanner. Sometimes you listen to patrol scanner and it comes in. What are some of the jobs that stick out from when you were out in the Atom car, a night tour or a day tour that you went to, and afterwards, you found yourself saying, wow, that was a rush?
Well, again, a lot of it's the basic rescue type jobs. I mean, it doesn't have to be the the blood and guts, but it's like, you know what, someone's pinned in a car, and you're able to get them out of the car. That's something that will send a rush. It's it, even something as simple as an animal job that's keeping the officers from doing what they need to do. They can't get into the building because there's a pit bull or something like that. I've hung outside of windows trying to talk to someone that wanted to jump. I mentioned Brian Waterbury earlier, but I remember being on a roof in the projects with a guy that wanted to jump from the roof. And, you respond to the job, and you're calling for the airbag, but until the airbag gets there, you're talking to that person. You have to try to establish a dialogue. When you get someone who wanted to kill themselves 15 minutes earlier, and you finally put hands on them and you prevented them from doing that, that's a rush. I know we all say we save lives every day. That's saving a life. That's talking someone down. Or another thing is, you're at the scene of a hostage job, and you're able to bring someone out with no one being hurt. And the most important thing is, given the nature of what we do, whether it's responding to barricade jobs, going under a train, climbing a bridge, jumping into the East River, at the end of the night, given all that, there is the possibility that we might face when everybody makes it back to the truck. That's a good feeling. That's a rush. The fact that day, everybody that we turned out with came home. Everybody came home.
Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of jobs like that over the years.
There are, when you're in ESU during the day, there are a number of jobs you can respond to that might prevent that from happening. Mm-hmm. Like I said, whether it's climbing a bridge, whether it's getting underneath a train, whether it's a barricaded perp job, or when I was in ESU also, you had the FAT team, the fugitive apprehension team. So you were doing 2-3 warrants a night. I always say there's only but so many doors you can go through before your luck runs out too. So again, every time you're executing a warrant and doing a dynamic entry, you don't know how that's going to turn out. You hope that it's going to turn out well, and that the person that you're attempting to apprehend doesn't want to fight. Usually if you go through that door and there are shots coming back at you, that person doesn't want to play. They want to hide. So that makes the job easier. It's when you're going through the door with that bunker and you got that rush going because you're the first one through the door, and you don't know what's going to happen once we boom that door. You don't know. You at that point, your heart rate, your blood pressure is probably the highest at that moment, because in seconds you're going through that door for someone that is a bad person.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't know what their mindset is. Their mindset could be, I'm not going back to jail, or their mindset could be, you know what, they're going to have to kill me. You don't know that.
Right. No, and that's where that flashbang comes in handy, because I remember watching.
I had one job at ESU in particular where a male was holding a baby hostage and had like one of these scalpels to the baby's neck. Mm. And it was a hostage job, and they got the male to agree that he would let EMS come in and check the baby before they would agree to his demands. They were like, we got to make sure the baby's okay. So I wind up going in, and this was a job with Billy Pizak, the aforementioned Billy Pizak also. We both posed as EMS workers. And what we were going to do is, I was going to go at the male's hand with the scalpel, and Billy was going to go to grab the baby. And luckily, we were able to apprehend the male, no injury to the baby, and go from there. But again, that's a situation where you're taking a big chance. One, there's a baby at risk. He's holding the baby in one hand, got the scalpel to the baby's neck in the other hand, and you're there knowing you're that close to life and death. And, God forbid it turned the wrong way. That's something you're going to have to live with forever, what's going on. But like I said, luckily we were able to save the baby, apprehend him, and the rest was history.
Thankfully, it turned out well. And those are the things. You got to come up with some ingenuity on the scene. Sometimes there's room for that. Sometimes there isn't. I recall a job on Cops where it was in two truck. Jim McVeigh, Pete Conlon were on it.
Wow.
And they're going up. Street crime had been alerted to a drug den in an apartment building. Lieutenant Sobachinsky was on this as well. They go in, and a guy is holding the door down. And they're like, okay, well, they just got a flashbang. And you hear one guy saying, police, heads up, move, throw it in. Safe to say that guy regretted holding that door down 5 seconds later, because all you heard was boom.
Then I remember a job, me and Paul Perricone.
Great guy. Love that guy.
I love Paul too. His niece actually wound up becoming an attorney and working for me in Staten Island DA's office when I came here. We were on a bridge job with a jumper on the Manhattan Bridge. I was going up the cable. Paulie had gone up around and was coming down. And I'll never forget, it was the day after Valentine's Day. I don't remember the year, but it was the day after Valentine's Day. And as we were closing in on him, he just turned and leaped off the Manhattan Bridge. And that always stuck with me because we weren't able to engage him in conversation. We hadn't gotten to that point where we were close enough to talk to him, but he saw us maneuvering down, turned and jumped off. And I always said, the day after Valentine's Day, somebody must have broken this guy's heart the night before or something, and he just no longer wanted to live. But it always bothered me that we were never able to reach him or to even engage in a dialogue to try to connect. I always felt like if I could talk to someone, I could connect with them. If I could get them to talk to me, eventually I could connect with anybody.
Right. Yeah. I
used to tell people, if you put me in a room with the leader of the Ku Klux Klan, by breakfast time, we would be having cereal and he would be pouring my milk.
I like that. And I think with people like that, unfortunately, they've already made their mind up. At that point, there's nothing that could stop them. And unfortunately, that gentleman made that choice. And you're right, somebody probably did break his heart. And those are the people that you always got to be especially cognizant of, especially this time of year. You always got to look out for those people.
But again, in ESU, you're asked to wear many hats. That's the point you brought up before. Mm-hmm. You're asked to do a lot. You're asked to be, whether it's, an elevator repairman, getting somebody out of an elevator, or whether it's to be a medic and assist someone, who is in medical distress, or whether it's to be a hostage negotiator, or, whether it's to be a tactical member of the, SWAT team. Like I said, it's ESU here. Everywhere else in the world is SWAT. But whether it's to engage in that dialect, or whether it's just to provide lighting for someone or to conduct a search, you're asked to wear many hats. And it's not easy, because I can't think of any other job where, your job description can change from day to day to day. Most people know what their job is when they go into work that day. And ESU, you don't know what your job is going to be that day. It could be something, it could be totally different every 5 minutes. And not just ESU, but for the police and fire department overall. You don't know what your job is going to be that day.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. One last note on emergency before I get to your law career. It's hours flown by. It's been great. We still got more to cover. Is we talk about him off the air. We talked about him a little bit on the air. Rod Gillis, who of course was one of the 14 emergency service cops who on September 11th, 2001, went into the World Trade Center and did not come out. Here's a guy that was awesome. Just not only, and he understood both sides of the coin in ESU, because he was not only a police officer in emergency service, he was also a sergeant in emergency service. So he knew the cop aspect, he knew the boss aspect. Working with him, and as we talked about off the air, nobody has a bad word to say about that guy. Not then, and certainly not now. So when you look back on Rod, who was a smart guy, not just as a cop, but as a person overall, tell me some of the fonder memories of working with him, and not only seeing him as the cop, but seeing him as Rod Gillis, the man.
I was going to say, the best way to describe Rodney is not just his ESU life, but personal life. Rodney was a great man first. And, forget about the police officer Rodney or the sergeant Rodney, the man Rodney. Rodney Gillis I tell people all the time, I got a picture in my office of Rodney right now. I have two pictures actually of Rodney in my office right now. Rodney was someone that I would consider a best friend. And he, again, although he was younger than me, He thought he was older than me. And, he would lecture me about some of my wayward ways, would give me advice and counsel. And, I used to tell people, and I spoke at Rodney's memorial when they finally found, I believe it was his shin bone they found, and they were able to identify him and officially classify him as dead. And I spoke at his memorial, and I told the story of how I would go to Rodney's house and we'd hang out and we'd drink and have chicken wings and relax, and I'd commiserate and I'd be talking to Rodney and I'd tell Rodney a story and I'd be sitting there griping about something. It was always me griping about something to Rodney, and I'd be griping for 10, 12, 15 minutes. And at the end of that, he'd go, and I'd be like, that's all you got to say? I just been talking and complaining and griping for 15 minutes, and that's the best you have to say. And Rodney is the type of guy that no matter what you needed, he was going to help you. And that's outside of emergency service. If you call Rodney 4 o'clock in the morning and say, I had a flat tire, he's getting up, putting his shirt on, he's coming to meet you. If you called Rodney and you needed assistance, he was going to be there. He was a great man. And that's why when I got that call on 9/11 from Maddie Lawrence, I had worked with Rodney on the late tours. Maddie had worked with Rodney on the late tours. And I remember I had left the police department by 9/11. I was working in the Brooklyn DA's office. And people in the Brooklyn DA's office knew my police career, knew my emergency service career. And I got a phone call from one of the attorneys in the office telling me that a plane had gone into the World Trade Center. And I was like, oh, okay, probably a medical episode. Somebody had an issue or whatever. And she kept calling, no, you need to look. So when I got to work, I actually was getting to work as she called. When I got to work, I get upstairs, I look out the window, I see the second plane going into the World Trade Center. I actually saw that. And then later that day, later that evening, I get the call from Maddie, and that call still echoes in my head today. And I just spoke recently at a 9/11 back in September memorial that the ESU guys were doing out here on Staten Island. And I spoke to them then about that call when Maddie said, Tommy, we can't find Rodney. And I still hear that call thing. And I'm like, what do you mean you can't find Rodney? She's like, we can't find him. And every day after that, I was hoping that I'd get the call saying, okay, we got him out, he's safe. Okay, we got him out, he's safe. But obviously, that call never came. And, again, there were other guys there as well. Santos Valentin was someone who I had joked around in the locker room at A-Truck before he left A-Truck. And, you look at these guys, Mike Curtin, these are guys that, again, these are guys, though. Rodney, for example, the day of 9/11, Rodney was doing a side gig at Third Watch. And he had gotten off that morning.
That's right. Yeah, he was on Third Watch a few times.
He had gotten off that morning and didn't have, and was sitting around the truck. It was some time to kill before he'd go into Third Watch. Sitting around the truck, and the World Trade Center happened. What did Rodney do? Went downstairs, got an empty truck, grabbed his gear, and went to the World Trade Center. So it wasn't like he was working and got the call or whatever, but he did what anyone that is watching your podcast that was in emergency service, or that was in the fire department rescue unit, or any engine, truck, ladder, whatever. He did what so many of them did that morning. Grabbed their stuff and went running. We all know that Steven Siller and, Tunnel the Towers, the guy that grabbed his gear, ran through the Battery Tunnel. So again, I've said it before, and I hate to be redundant and repetitive, but it's in your DNA.
Yeah.
It's in your DNA that, you know what? You don't have to be told to do this. You don't have to be asked to do this. That bell rings, you're responding. And that's what Rodney did, and so many others. And it's just, I don't know. I was angry at him for a long time afterwards, but I understood. Because I would have done the same thing.
Yeah.
I was angry at him for a long time.
No, I get it. And I get chills as you say that. I mean, all 20, if you look at the NYPD aspect of it alone, that's not to discount what the FTNY did, Port Authority Police, EMS, court officers, Secret Service, FBI, which both lost agents that day. One story that always comes to mind is you were saying it, and it comes from my Bomb Squad miniseries, Claude Richards. Claude Richards was home when that call came in. And Claude Richards, as he left the door, he lived in Greenwich Village, so he didn't have that long of a drive to get to the 6th precinct where the bomb squad was. A few days later, because he ended up in a team with Mike Curtin and John DeLara, and that's where he was killed when the North Tower collapsed. They went through his apartment, and I always tell the story, and I'm getting the goosebumps now as I tell it again. They found his detective shield, to your point about seeing your DNA, on top of his last will and testament. So there's a guy that was off duty, home, didn't have to go into work until later, saw what was going on, knew, hey, listen, I might not come home today. Didn't care, went out the door, went to help, did not come home, but still went anyway, despite the danger. So, that's what, not just what ESU does, but that's what the NYPD, FDNY, Port Authority Police, on and on.
But that is the point I'm making, because now we're talking about the other side of my career as a prosecutor. I've worked on 3 police murder cases. I've worked on the murder of Bobby Parker and Pat Rafferty.
Yeah.
And I worked on the murder of Dylan Stewart. And we obtained convictions in those cases. Dylan Stewart was someone who was home and running late for work. He called the sergeant that night and said, I'm going to be late, but I'm coming in. The sergeant told him, take the night. Don't come in. Take the night. We got enough personnel. We're good. Take the night. He's like, no, I'm coming in. Sergeant said, no, we got enough. Take the night. Dylan Stewart came in and wind up getting murdered that night because it was in his DNA, public service, come into work, do the job. Bobby Parker and Pat Rafferty, 2 detectives from the 6-7 precinct. Bobby Parker had been friends with the mother of the person who killed him. I won't dignify by calling his name. Bobby Parker had been trying to mentor this, for lack of a better word, person who didn't get it. He was, and I'll use the word mush because that's what the defense attorney calls him during the trial. He's like, my client, not a bad guy, he's a mush. He goes, that's what we call people in the streets who are still depending on their mother. They're grown or whatever, but they're depending on their mother for support. So here was a guy who his mother was having problems with. Instead of him taking care of his mother, she basically was taking care of him. So on this day, he takes his mother's car. Bobby Parker gets the call from mom saying, hey, he's got my car again. What do I do? Bobby says, well, if he comes back, give me a call. He comes back with the car. She calls Bobby and says he's back. Bobby was going over to talk to him and said, dude, this is your mother. You can't be doing this to your mother, etc. So he goes to Pat Rafferty and says, hey, Pat, take a ride with me. The 2 of them go. They go to confront this individual, and they wind up getting into a struggle with him. He takes Bobby Parker's gun and shoots and kills Detective Parker and Detective Rafferty. Again, here's a guy that kills 2 detectives because he took his mother's car. But again, talk about being in your DNA. Bobby Parker being that social worker, because we wear many hats, being that mentor, because we wear many hats, being that guy that's trying to tell a guy from the streets, hey, listen, you always got to respect mom. Don't do this to mom, etc. And he winds up getting killed. Unbelievable. But when we talk about what's in our DNA, it's in our DNA.
Yeah. And with that job,
it was in Rodney's DNA. And
absolutely.
One of those officers and those firefighters and court officers and Secret Service agents, it's in your DNA.
For those in the audience that may not be familiar with the incidents and the context behind them, I won't go into the graphic details, but Detective Parker and Rafferty, of course, were laying there mortally wounded. Rafferty was able to fire a couple shots off and hit the perpetrator. Detective Parker, despite being mortally wounded and knowing he was going to die, called 911, said, "This is who the guy is. This is what he's driving. This is, what he looks like.
And not
I'm
only that,
going out."
Mike, when he put it over the radio, and that if for those that have heard that call that may have been present at the trial, he's talking into the radio and he tells Central, his picture is on the dashboard. He had a picture of this individual on the dashboard that had just shot him.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And he calmly says, "I'm going out." Those were his last words.
And those were his last words as he laid there dying. He's still in police mode, or as the person in the chat room said, he's still in cop mode. Mm-hmm. He's dying. He died not long thereafter, but he was in cop mode, making sure as life was pouring out of his body that he was that cop that was going to help in the investigation of this individual.
That was September 10th, 2004. The other job was Dylan Stewart, and this is something you guys got to hear if you haven't heard it already. And Vic, if you can, try to find a picture of Detective Stewart so we could share it here. November 28th, 2005, to your point, he was late, comes in. Call comes in, I think, for a stolen car, if I remember correctly. It may have been a stolen car. So they find where the car is. They pull up to the perps, try to pull them over. Chase ensues. During the course of the chase, shots ring out from the perpetrator's vehicle. One of the bullets comes in, and Detective Stewart had on a bulletproof vest. And unfortunately, the bullet did not hit the vest. It hit him in the armpit, which Tommy's motioning to, and it traveled down and severed numerous arteries and pierced his heart. So here he is, mortally wounded. He gets out the car. He's still chasing the guy. He chased the guy until he collapsed.
We're talking about cop mode. And his partner at the time, Paul Lipka, God rest his soul, he was subsequently killed in a motorcycle accident. So may he rest in peace as well.
Yeah. And these are hard cases as a prosecutor. Of course, you had a lot of notable cases over the years. And as you said, you're NYPD trained. You can handle anything. One person that had a profound impact on you, and I imagine still does to this day, was Charlie Hines. So getting to work with somebody like that, to talk about somebody that understood the law, what was he like, and what are some of the biggest lessons you feel he taught you personally?
Charles Hines had a huge impact on me. One, he gave me my first legal job. And I remember when I was a law student at St. John's, I took his class. And it was a Saturday morning class, and you had trial advocacy. So you played the part of a prosecutor during the trial. And I remember during my opening statement and the direct examination of the exercise, he said, "Mr. Ridges, come see me during the break." So I'm thinking to myself, wow, was I that bad? He goes, "You're a police officer, right?" I said, "Yes, sir." Well, he goes, "Well, that was pretty good." He goes, "What are you hoping to do after law school?" Me, because my mother didn't raise any dummies, I said, "Well, I'm hoping for a job with your office." And he said, "Oh, okay." He goes, "And how would you be able to do that? Would you be able to make it work?" I said, "Well, at that time, there was one other cop in the city who had taken a leave from the police department to go become a prosecutor. And he was working, I believe, in the Bronx at the time. So I said, well, yeah, there is something where I can apply to take a qualified leave so you can be loaned from one city agency to another city agency. I couldn't do it if I was working for a private law firm. There's got to be another city agency." So he said, "Well, make an appointment. Come see me. Come see me." So I made an appointment with his secretary. I went to see him, and he said, "Have you figured out how to make it work?" And I said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "Okay. If you want the job is yours, but you're going to take a pay cut." And I looked at him and said, "Okay, everything's not about money." And then I learned from Charles Hines, once I got to the office, he had a program at the time called a special unit. It was called the Assault on Police Officer Program, APOP. And it was a unit that dealt with cops that had been shot, shot at, or seriously injured. Those were the cases that went to that unit. And he said, you, with your police background, would be perfect for that unit. So every case that came into my office were cases where cops had been fired upon, shot at, seriously injured. I had a case with Picarito. Picarito was a cop in the 7-7 who, him and his partner, had stopped an individual that they had seen looking at doors, and the individual dropped the gun when they approached him. So his partner went down to pick up the gun, and as his partner went down to pick up the gun, this defendant had another gun behind him and pulled it out and shot Picarito in the chest. But his bulletproof vest, and some of you may have seen this at the time, the bulletproof vest actually caught the round. And Ray Kelly at the time did a press conference holding up the vest. And so that was one interesting case. And, you had it, but Charles Hines' motto was, what's the right thing to do? That's what you ask yourself in every case. What's the right thing to do? And again, he was someone, and I know, some people may have felt differently, but he was very pro-police, and he was very much into making sure that justice was served. There's an assistant commissioner with corrections right now, Sean Kelly. I met Sean Kelly when he was a sergeant in the 6-7. And I had a case where an individual had fired multiple rounds at him and his team. And, I wind up being, Sean and I formed a bond and a friendship throughout that. So I always thought my police background allowed me to handle those cases better because I understood where the cops were coming from. There was a school of thought at one time, and I'm not just saying in Brooklyn, but, with ADAs around, that getting injured was a part of your job. And I used to have to school them on that and say, where in the job description did it say that, when you take this job, getting injured is a part of the job? It's like being a construction worker. They don't put in the job constriction, part of the job is getting injured. So some people would minimize a police officer injury because, it's part of your job. No, it's not. And again, I never allow that attitude to fester. And that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. And then as I elevated in the Brooklyn DA's office, I wind up getting assigned to the Homicide Bureau. So I was in the Homicide Bureau in Brooklyn for 7 years. So I've done over 50 murder trials. So that was something that was, impressive, and something that, I'm a kid from Bed-Stuy that, I'm sitting there doing murder cases. And I'm like, wow, I'm handling cases where you're looking at all types of homicides. You're seeing people that are shooting each other over stepping on each other's foot, over looks at each other, over you stared at my girlfriend the wrong way, mistaken identity. I did a murder case once where it started because guys bumped into each other getting off an elevator. And then, they wind up chasing the guy down and shooting him because he bumped into him getting off the elevator. It's ridiculous. And, so I did that. I was in Brooklyn, the Brooklyn DA's office for 18 years. And like I said, 7 of those were on homicide cases. I did, like I said, 3 cop murder cases. I was on the case of Ahmet St. Guillen. That was the college co-ed from John Jay College. So I did that case. And then in 2016, the district attorney of Staten Island, Mike McMahon, got elected and reached out to me and said, hey, would you like to be a part of my executive team? So I interviewed with him, and he offered me a position. I live on Staten Island, so he offered me a position, and I came out to Staten Island as an executive, and I've been here ever since. So again, I have the opportunity to go out and speak with different groups and different organizations and talk to them about, I always say I'm a real life law and order. First I was a cop, now I'm the prosecutor. That's how I always start off my spiel of being that real life law and order.
Yep.
So we have, great things. And I had a chance to work with Jen Yee. Jen Yee, who was a lieutenant when I was in ESU, show you how things come full circle, became the borough commander out here on Staten Island. So, him and I, when we met, and I used to brag to people about how he hadn't changed. He was always a great man, and you know what? He was a great man when he was a lieutenant. He's a great man as the 2-star chief of Staten Island, and he recently retired not too long ago. But it was just ironic and funny that we went from all those years of working together in ESU to now he's all these years later, borough commander, and we're back together again. I have the same experience now with Joe Galata. Joe Galata is the borough commander now out here of Staten Island, and we've had experience working together from my Brooklyn days and everything else. So, it goes to show you how life can be circular sometimes.
Oh, and I'm glad you brought that up as well, because it does show, if you pay it forward and you do the right things in life, it all comes full circle in the best of ways. Before we continue, Vic does have the picture of Detective Stewart for the audience to see if we can just pull that up. Now
Yep.
is him. Yep. And I think he was posthumously promoted, and that was a rough time for the NYPD. Before we get back to your career, because about 2 weeks after this, Danny Eshantegi gets killed off duty in the Bronx, breaking up a robbery. They classified it as a line of duty death because he was acting in a police capacity. But within a 2-week span, he had 2 very bright, promising young lives get cut short, courtesy of felonious gunfire. Now, I want to go back for a second because you mentioned Ahmet St. Guillen. This was an interesting case. This is 2006. So the city's different by then. This is a safer city. Crime has gone way down. You're not seeing stuff like this anymore. And here's a college co-ed young girl, beautiful girl. And this was something that really jolted the city. So I didn't know you had a hand in this, but I want to know more now. For the audience that's not familiar with this case, tell us about it.
Ahmet St. Guillen had been out drinking with some friends. And they had been drinking, and at the end of the night, the friends were ready to go home. She did not want to go home. And they tried to encourage her, let's go home, let's go home. And she did not want to go home. So they left her. And the defendant, again, I'm not going to call his name because I don't want to dignify him. We convicted him, and he's serving life without parole as well. But he was a bouncer at the bar and offered to escort her out at the end of the night. He winds up putting her in his van, doing all kinds of vile things to her. So it started in Manhattan. He then winds up taking her and dumping her by Fountain Avenue in the 7-5 East New York, and she was found there. It came to light days later who she was, because she was from Boston. So her family had been looking for her, had been trying to find her, couldn't reach her, and finally realized that this person who was found in Fountain over by Vandalia, over by the telephone place over there, this was Ahmet St. Guillen. And this wasn't the first person that he had done this to. He had done this to others, and there was one woman who testified during the trial who he tried to abduct, but she was able to get away. So again, the times had changed then, Mike, as you put it, but unfortunately, we know from human nature, sometimes people don't change. This was a vile, sick individual who, again, it didn't matter what times we were talking about, that was in his DNA. And the best thing that we could do was what we did was convict him and take him off the street so that no one has to be at risk of their safety ever again because of where he's at. I always say for people like him and people like I described earlier that, took the life of Dylan Stewart and Bobby Parker, Pat Rafferty, there's a special place for them that, in the afterlife where they can go to.
Yeah. It was not exactly the kind of people you'd want to surround yourself with, but they'll be dealt with.
Again, the John Jay School set up a scholarship for her in her name for students there after her death. We went back, myself and I tried the case with Ken Taub. Ken Taub was the chief of homicide in Brooklyn at the time. So I tried the case with Ken Taub. We both went back years ago when they were establishing the scholarship, and they wanted to recognize myself and Ken Taub. The Bobby Parker and Pat Rafferty case I did with Mitch Benson, who was another supervisor in homicide at the time. And Dylan Stewart, I deal with Mark Hale, who was another supervisor in homicide. So, those were some dark days. Those were some dark days, and again, like I said, the times may change, but not always the people.
Right. Well, listen, it reminds you of the dangers of police work. It can always change on a dime. You never know what you're going to walk into moment to moment. And that's why, listen, I can understand, even on a traffic stop, whatever encounter it may be, if you're just going about your business, make sure you make it as easy as possible for the officer because, listen, you could be walking up, and this has been brought up before. I remember, and I cited this article before. I was reading an article about the bomb squad in preparation for a show I was doing for that miniseries from the Atlantic in 1994. And they were talking to Joe Patowski, who, great guy, he did about 18 years in the bomb squad, retired in 07. And he's like, well, the author of the story, don't you feel it's dangerous? Don't you feel like you have the most dangerous job in the NYPD? And he's like, no, not at all. He's like, yeah, well, don't get me wrong, explosives are hazardous, but I feel I have the safest job. And he's like, why? The author, and Joe Patowski's retort was, I don't have to worry about somebody walking up behind me while I'm doing my job and shooting me in the back. Patrol does. You could be talking to your partner about the ball game the night before. You come around the corner, there's a drug deal going down. They got a gun. You walk into what you think is a noise complaint. Turns out it's a domestic. You don't know. You don't know.
It's the unknown that is what's dangerous, Mike. Like you said, you can go to, and I talk to guys. I go around and I do lectures. I've spoken to supervisors. I've spoken to patrol officers. And again, every time there's a new class, I welcome the new class of officers. And again, it is the unknown. It is the unknown. You can, a DV job, a domestic violence job can go from nothing to something in seconds. A car stop can go bad. An aided case, an EDP job. Any one of these jobs can go bad immediately. That's why, again, you have to be in, and I know I'm echoing it a lot of times, you have to be in cop mode all the time. That doesn't necessarily mean adversarial. It means cautious. You have to be, again, when you're a cop, cops, I always say, have to make judgment calls. You have to size people up immediately. Somebody walking up to ask you directions. You don't know what that person is coming up to you to do. You don't know what's going to happen. You have to be ready to react. And they teach you, watch the hands. If someone's going to do something with you, it starts with the hands. If they're going to shoot you, punch at you, take a swing at you, try to slice you, it starts with the hands. So again, cops have to make judgment calls on the fly. You have to judge whether someone is going to be friend or foe very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Not an easy discernment to make.
And again, I can't think of any other job where you have to do that. I really can't think of any other job where the nature of your job is because of how people feel about you and what you do, or whether they're upset with the government at the moment, they're upset with the criminal justice system, they're upset with law enforcement, but you're their target for the day and they don't even know you. You have to size people up throughout the day.
I go back to something Joe Dolan, who you work with in emergency, also another guy that went to the bomb squad later on, told me when he was on the show last year, which is advice an old timer gave him. Be polite to everyone you meet, and I'm paraphrasing, but always have a plan to kill them. Because for that reason, if they turn on you and you don't know. If they turn on you, be courteous, be professional. But if it's going to hit the fan, have a plan.
Because it can get ugly very quickly. Very quickly. And, I don't know why it's been that way, but you have to be prepared. I mean, again, we go to work every day. You go to work every day. You put on that uniform, and you're a slave to the radio. You are responding to people who are making 911 calls, and you're responding to those 911 calls to help people. I've worked with a lot of cops, as we've mentioned. I've worked in a lot of assignments. I never once worked with an officer who said, I'm here today because I want to hurt somebody.
Right.
I've never once heard a cop say, you know what, I'm going out there today and kill someone. I've never experienced that. I've never seen that. I've always worked with cops that, were there to help people. And that's how you started your day. And you hopefully wanted to come back at the end of the day and return to your locker and be able to go home to your family. You spend so much time away from your family. And again, I tell people all the time, you're in a patrol car or the REP, or you're in a vehicle with your partner more than you are with your wife and kids. You know, you're sitting there for 8 hours in the car. You might be in your house 8 hours. You don't see your kids for 8 hours straight. You're in that car for 8 hours. And, you know, you're spending that time with your partner, and you're learning each other, and you're finishing each other's sentences. You know, it's like, wow.
Yeah,
But
no,
but
it's
again,
quite a bond.
but again, it's also a bond because you're dependent on each other. You know, again, you want to make sure at the end of the day that you both go home. You know, you're watching his or her back, and they're watching your back. And again, I say this now all the time. You know, we see some of the things that happen, you know, with officers nowadays. I go back to my day. You give me two officers could take down a mob. Two officers back in the day could take down you. I'd put them up against anybody. You give me two officers, you give me my nightstick, and we're good to go. We're good to go.
I like it. No, that's true. That's true. I
And
did want to ask.
it makes you scratch your head these days.
No, you're right, and I think it segues perfectly into the other question I wanted to ask you before the rapid fire, which is laws have certainly, without diving too much into it, have certainly changed a lot in the city recently. So as a prosecutor, it's important to evolve with that, you know. And although it does make you scratch your head at times, you got to evolve with it because, you know, for better or worse, they are the laws. These days, out on Staten Island, how have those laws had an impact, or have they had an impact, and how does the work in the district attorney's office go on for you?
I think the laws, it would be, I couldn't say that they haven't impacted what we do every day. I mean, for example, you look at bail reform. You look at bail reform with judges not having any discretion. You know, you used to be able to, if you had a recidivist or a person that was a problem in the community didn't want that person in the community either. It wasn't just the cops. You know, you were able to request bail for certain crimes. You know, you could look at a person's rap sheet and see, okay, this person's been arrested 8 times. This person I'm going to request bail for. Now with the bail reform, given what the charge is, regardless of how many times they've been arrested, I may not be able to request bail. So it makes the job harder, but it doesn't stop you from doing the job, because people don't ask to be victims. I've said this 100 times. Nobody raises their hand and say, pick me. I want to be a victim today. Someone puts that tag on them, and it's not fair to you if you're frustrated with the system to not give 150% to that case, to that victim, in spite of the challenges that you may be facing at that time. You still have to get in the ring and fight to, you know what, bring justice about for that person. They don't want to hear about bail reform when someone stuck a gun in their face, or when someone is, you know, burglarizing their store. They don't want to hear about the issues with the legislature or the issues with the laws or whatever else. They want to know that you're going to go down fighting. And I tell people all the time, of the over 50 murder cases that I've had, I didn't win them all. But I can tell you right now, I still get calls from family members of cases where I've lost, who call me and say, hey, you know, today was the anniversary of his death. I thought about you. I just wanted to call and check in on you and make sure you're okay. Is everything all right with you? Wow. Or they'll call and tell you that, you know what, someone in the family is getting married, or someone in the family just had a child, and they're like, you know what, I thought about you today, or maybe on their loved one's birthday or something. They'll call and check in because they knew that if Tom Ridges was on the case, he was given 150%. And I used to tell them from the onset of the case, I can't guarantee you a verdict. Any prosecutor, any lawyer that tells you they can guarantee you a verdict is lying, because you never know what 12 people sitting in a jury are going to do. They might, again, I always say, if you would have asked Marsha Clark and Chris Staten on the O.J. Simpson case, if they thought they were going to win, they would have told you yes. How'd that turn out? So there are no guarantees in a case. They would have told you, we got this evidence, we got that, we got this. There are no guarantees, but I used to tell them, you can rest assured that I'm going to give you 150%. And that's why I still get the calls to this day from family members who know Tom Ridges went down fighting. And my number's been the same for 35 years. So they know how to reach me.
Well said. And I think we can go into the rapid fire on that note. This has been great. It's been an hour 40, but it doesn't feel like it. This has been a fantastic show. And we'll end as we always do with this rapid fire. And one of the questions you already answered earlier, so it's really just 4 questions because most uplifting, delivering 3 babies, it doesn't get much more uplifting than that. So I'll ask you only 4. First, funniest call you ever responded to?
Funniest call. I don't know if this can be PG, but funniest call I had, and this is back when I was in the 8A precinct, responded to a job, and the woman had gotten into a fight with her man, and we referred to him as her boyfriend. And she goes, "That's not my boyfriend. That's just my hump partner." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And I was like, that was, again, at that point, I'm a young cop. I'm on the job 2 years, and I was like, ouch. Okay. Welcome to the real life of policing and people telling it like it is.
Well, yeah, it doesn't get much more honest than that.
It could be more straightforward than that.
Yeah, that's about as honest as it can get. Second, funniest colleagues you ever worked with?
Oh my God. Funniest. Dwayne Bonds. Dwayne Bonds was a straight shooter, would tell it as it is. I love the late tour guys, that I work with. Rodney, Rodney Gillis was funny in his own way. You know what? All those guys, listen, we had some fun times. We worked hard, but we played hard. So we had some fun times during those days. And I guess that was kind of like a release valve for some of the things that you saw and everywhere else. I mean, whether it was joking around in the firehouse, or the truck, or something along those lines. We had good times. So those were fun times for me. I miss those days. So much. Oh, sometimes some of the club meetings we would have when I was in Brooklyn off Task Force. Scott Green used to have a van that we parked in the Burger King parking lot, and we'd have our club meetings in his van. This was one of the old coach vans back in the day. That's how I'm dating myself. But we had, again, like I said, we had good times back then. For a job where you never know if you're going home at the end of the day, you enjoy every moment. And that's what we did. Every stop along the way, whether it was street crime, when I worked midnights in street crime, we'd get off and we'd all go have breakfast together, Bobby Iaboni, some of the guys that were there, Nikki Felicia, Fidel DeVivo. Again, you realize that life is not promised to you. There are no guarantees. So I think the one thing you learn to do as a police officer is enjoy the moment. Enjoy the moment, because you don't know what tomorrow brings. You may not know what the next hour brings. So, enjoy every moment.
Absolutely. Actually, you know what? I can ask you a third question. It's not going to be most uplifting, but it's a question Joe Maliga had earlier, which is regarding those 3 babies that you delivered. Do you keep in touch with any of the families?
None at all. No.
Oh, okay.
To me at the time, again, it didn't seem that big of a deal. I wish now I had, because I see all these news stories about guys delivering babies and saving babies, and years later, the baby is going into the academy, or the baby is going somewhere. And I'm like, I wonder what those kids are doing nowadays. What happened to them? And you know what? It would be a nice story.
It would be.
I tell people all the time, of all the, because one of the things I also do, I've taught. I also became a professor. So I've taught at John Jay College, and I currently teach at Monroe College. I teach criminal justice at Monroe College. But I say, I try to impute knowledge to the kids about law enforcement. Because I tell them, I said, I'm at the end of my career. I'm in the winter of my career. I've been doing this since 1985, when I raised my right hand in the police academy. So we're talking now 39 years. It's about time for me to turn the lights off and say, sail off into the sunset. So I tell them I'm about to pass the baton to them. And I try to get into their brain and their thoughts to see how they think about the police and how they feel about the police, and let them know that police are necessary. Forget all this rhetoric and all the hyperbole you hear and everybody talking about, this anti-police sentiment. I don't give a darn, I'll keep it PG, what people are saying, Mike, about the police. All those people that don't like the police, let someone break into their house tonight. When they pick up that phone, who are they calling? Let someone stick a gun in their face and try to rob them. Who are they calling? So all these people that want to bash the police, all these people that want to knock the police or have that anti-police sentiment, ask them what they're going to do when someone breaks into their house, someone breaks into their car, someone snatches their cell phone. When they pick up that phone and dial 911, if it's not the police, who do they want to answer?
I'll give you a hint. It ain't Ghostbusters, that's for sure.
Exactly. It's not Ghostbusters. Exactly.
Well said. Well said. And the fourth question of the rapid fire, second to last, then or now, favorite bar or restaurant in New York City?
Ooh.
You can say multiple here.
O'Keefe's, downtown Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm.
Dean Street in the 88. Trying to think where else. That's about it. I'm not a going out person. That's just me. So those are the places where I have some of my fonder memories. But other than that, that's about it, Mike. I'm sorry on that one.
No, you're good. You listen. Yeah, you're good. There's some people that have like
17. I tell people I've worn a lot of hats in my days, whether it's police officer, professor, prosecutor, whatever. But the proudest hat that I wear now came November 24th when I became a grandfather for the first time. So
congratulations.
So that is one of that is my, I feel like, and I tell people this, as a cop, you sacrifice a lot. You miss birthdays, you miss school meetings, you miss baseball games, you miss graduations, you miss a lot because you want your kids to have a better life than you had. Grandchildren, that's a second chance to do it all over. That's a second chance to do it all over and get back all the times that you missed. Every time I hear the song Cats in the Cradle with Harry Chapin, It reminds me of a cop's life. Your son is your son's trying to get time with you. You don't have the time to spend time with your son. And then when your son gets grown and you want to spend time with your son, he's saying all the things that you said to him when you didn't have time for him. So grandchildren are a way of doing it all over again. You can spend time with them and catch up on those things that you missed. And my granddaughter is 2 months now, so I'm a happy man.
There you go. Congratulations. Very happy to hear that. The last question of the rapid fire, rather it be in terms of the law and getting into it as an attorney side, specifically as a district attorney, prosecutor, or the police department, what advice would you give anyone entering either profession?
My advice would be, listen, always do the right thing. The right thing is not always the popular thing. Like I mentioned earlier, discretion. Somehow guys have lost the art of discretion. I mentioned when I was in NSU that I learned how to be a cop from guys like Mike Prate and people like that who taught you don't always have to give someone a summons. You don't always have to, again, I know the policies have changed, but you can't tell someone take a walk anymore. But again, there were times when you went to a guy on the corner and you called the guy over, again, they were hanging out, making too much noise. It wasn't about pounding your chest. You'd call the guy over and say, listen, you guys got to step off. I'm going to go around the block. I'm going to do my post again. But when I come back, don't be here. That's letting the guy save face. You're not calling him out in front of his boys, everything else. You're walking off. You're letting him go back to the crew. And you know what? All of a sudden, it becomes his ideas. Hey, guys, you know what? Let's get out of here. Now you didn't embarrass him. It wasn't about pounding your chest. My advice is treat people treat people like you want to be treated. I always say nice never goes out of style. Nice, not as there are times when as a cop you have to do your job, Again, people aren't calling you because things are great. People are calling you because something bad is happening most times. So the situation might result in someone being arrested. It might result in a summons being issued. But there are ways to do things too. Like again, I've never put handcuffs on someone in front of their kids. I just never did that. If I was going to give someone a ticket and the kids were in the car, I never embarrassed a person in front of their kids. I wasn't going to berate a father in front of his kids. There's no call for that. And like I said, I've had collars where back in the day when you could smoke, I bought a guy a pack of cigarettes on the way to Central Booking. This is the day when, this is the time when you were going to be in Central Booking for days. I've bought guys sandwiches on the way to Central Booking. I've stopped at McDonald's. Again, I didn't put you don't get reimbursed for that. It's dignity. I would tell anyone who wanted to go into any profession, treat people like you would want to be treated. Nice never goes out of style. Be true to yourself and never dishonor the profession. Never dishonor whichever profession, whether it's as a prosecutor or whether it's as a police officer. Never dishonor the profession.
Wow. This has been a show. Thank you so much. I can't thank you enough. I mean, there's so many highlights here. It's going to be hard to choose later on which one. But man, I can't thank you enough for coming on. Before I say goodbye to the audience, any shout outs to anyone or anything you'd like to give?
Oh my God, Mike, for me to give the shout outs, it's going to take forever, so I won't do that. But what I do want to say to everyone that I've ever been around, I've interacted with, I've worked with, from people like I've named earlier, the Mike Prates, the Tony Sanpietros, the Dave Canes, all of those people. And if I didn't call your name, please know that I thank you for everything that I learned from you. I thank you for the opportunity that I had to be around you, to learn from you, the lessons that I got from you. And I hope that you were never sorry that I was in your life at any point. I just want to thank you. Like I said, I'm to the point now where I just got promoted. I'm first executive ADA here on Staten Island. So I'm sitting in rooms making decisions, law enforcement decisions. I'm speaking with executives from the police department on a daily basis, 7 days a week, 365. And a lot of what I take into account with those decisions that I make with regard to cases or defendants, it comes from the life lessons that I learned from my days in the police department. So to anyone that has ever worked with Tommy Ridges wants to say thank you for everything that you did to help me achieve all that I've accomplished and to be where I'm at today. I always tell people they see the glory, but they don't know the story. You guys are the story. So thank you all for my life and career at NYPD and where I am at now. God bless you all. Please remain safe. For those of you that have kids on the job, may they remain safe. And I truly love all of you. I love you guys.
And this has been, like I said, this has been fantastic. Thanks to everybody that tuned in tonight. What a show this was. Rather you listened on YouTube, LinkedIn, or Twitter, or rather you're listening to this later. It's always appreciated. Tom, stick around. We'll talk off the air. Before we go, real quick, this is going to be a pre-recorded episode coming up next on the Mike the New Haven podcast for those of you. This is going to come out Monday night at 7. I recorded this with her last Monday, and that's going to be Lisa Mateo. She used to be on WPIX. You may remember her from there. She was there from 2000 until 2018. She's currently at Bloomberg. That was a fun interview, about a half hour or so. Short one, but that comes out, of course, at 7 o'clock this upcoming Monday. Again, pre-recorded. No show Wednesday. I'll take that day off. But we will be back next Friday, the 16th, and that's going to be with Deputy Chief Rick Ettinger, who handled hazmat down in Virginia as a chief with the fire department down there, for what will be a brand new miniseries that will debut, Volume 1 of The Best of the Bravest nationwide. We have, of course, The Best of the Bravest chronicling the FDNY. We're going to do an offshoot of that. And the first guest for that will be Deputy Chief Ettinger. In the meantime, on behalf of Tommy Ridges, this has been Volume 42 of the E-Men inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit, and on behalf of producer Victor as well. I'm Mike Colón. We will see you next time. And as the E-Men like to say, anytime, baby. Take care. Good night. Have a great weekend.
you.